first thing I'd like to do to get us started is to invite our parish priest, the parish priest of St. Henry's Catholic Church, Father Pavel Ratajak, to come up and open us with the prayer.
Maybe those who are able to could stay, who are not having laptops in the lap. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Our Lady, seat of wisdom,
Pray for us.
Saint Edward.
Pray for us.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Thank you very much, Father Pavel. So good evening, and welcome to the 5th annual Dr. Keith Cassidy Lecture. My name is Dr. Christine Schinken. I'm the president of Our Lady Seat of Wisdom College, which is pleased to present this public lecture to the community. I extend warm greetings to all of you on behalf of the college, and it is great to see so many of you here. Just briefly, for those of you who don't know, the college's mission is to provide an excellent liberal arts education that forms the whole person in a faithfully Catholic context. And since I won't get a chance to mention this later, I will invite those in attendance to sign up for our newsletter, which is free, and it comes out 3 times a year. It's available in hard copy or by email. And you may also wish to consider joining our mission through prayer support and financial support if able. We're a registered charity, and we rely very much on private donations of all sizes, including monthly giving options. And every donation truly counts. So if you feel inspired to do that or to sign up for our newsletter, there is a donation station by the door, which you can check out later. Our Stewardship and Development Officer, Catherine Longo, will be managing that table. She's at the back with the burgundy dress. Thank you, Catherine. All right. The Dr. Keith Cassidy Lecture Series was launched in 2019 in order to honor the legacy of Our Lady Seat of Wisdom College's past president, Dr. Keith Cassidy. This series consists of lectures presented by noted intellectuals on topics of significance to the academic community. This evening, our speaker is Dr. Holly Ordway, whom our own Dr. Natasha Duquette, Vice President, Academic and Dean, and Professor of Literature, will now introduce in a more fulsome manner. Please welcome Dr. Duquette.
It's great to see so many people in the room and to kind of feel the love of Tolkien in the atmosphere. So I will now introduce our speaker. Dr. Holly Ordway is the Cardinal Francis George Professor of Faith and Culture at Word on Fire Institute and visiting Professor of Apologetics at Houston Christian University. She holds a PhD in English from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and is subject editor for the Journal of Inkling Studies. Her book, Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages, Word on Fire Academic 2021, received the 2022 Mythopoeic Society Scholarship Award in Inkling Studies. So Dr. Ordway has written prolifically and published multiple works. 3 of her books with which I'm most familiar are her spiritual autobiography, Not God's Type, An Atheist Academic Lays Down Her Arms, published in 2014, Apologetics and the Christian Imagination, An Integrated Approach to Defending the Faith, published in 2017, and Tales of Faith, A Guide to Sharing the Gospel Through Literature, published in 2022. Dr. Ordway's work has been very important to me both personally and professionally. Her account of her conversion into Catholicism in Not God's Type helped me eventually enter the Catholic Church 2 years after she published the book in 2016. Her practical survey of literature through the eyes of Catholicism and Tales of Faith provided a model of intellectual hospitality through her careful interweaving of primary sources with theologically robust explication. She places a map before her readers and encourages them to join her as a fellow companion on a convivial journey, which is the same thing she will do tonight. She's both humble and sound in her own reception of literature. For example, in Tales of Faith, she elucidates Dante's allegorical representation of the cooperation between reason and grace with striking clarity. She balances scholarly heft with warmth and generosity, assuming the best of her readers and then prompting us into greater ethical integrity along the way. I'd like to conclude my introduction by just briefly reading some of Dr. Ordway's own words about Tolkien from her book, Apologetics and the Christian Imagination. Okay, so she writes, J.R.R. Tolkien gives us a sketch of how imaginative literature can help. He argues that one of the functions of fantasy literature is what he calls recovery, a regaining of a clear view. Using the metaphor of a dirty, smudged window, he says that we need to, quote, clean our windows so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness or familiarity. Stories can help us do that, Ordway writes. For example, consider how a reader can be drawn into Tolkien's world of Middle-earth. After reading about the Ents, Treebeard, the other shepherds of the trees, we can look at an ordinary tree, a pine or oak, and think, how extraordinary really is a tree? Perhaps we will think differently about efforts to protect the environment or plant more trees in our cities and towns. Good stories and poetry help us see more clearly when we close the book and re-enter ordinary life. So I trust that we will all see clearly, a little bit more clearly after our time with Dr. Ordway and J.R.R. Tolkien tonight.
Thank you very much for that beautiful introduction. Thank you for that warm welcome. It is really a pleasure to be here, this beautifully named Our Lady Seat of Wisdom. I think that Tolkien would approve, and we will come back to that a little bit later in this talk. So this year, 2023, marks the 50th anniversary of Tolkien's death. And all around the world, people have been celebrating Tolkien and his imaginative legacy. And I've recently been in the UK, and here, and then there in the UK, they've honored him at the Royal Mint with a new £2 coin. It's one of the first with the head of King Charles III, and on the other side, Tolkien's monogram, describing him as writer, poet, and scholar. So the title of my talk tonight is Tolkien's Faith and the Foundations of Middle-earth. And I will begin with a quote from one of Tolkien's letters. It's one that I imagine most Tolkien fans have seen before, or at least the first line, which is the most often quoted. He writes, "The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. That is why I have not put in or have cut out practically all references to anything like religion, to cults and practices in the imaginary world. For the religious element is absorbed into the story and the symbolism. However, that is very clumsily put, and sounds more self-important than I feel. For as a matter of fact, I have consciously planned very little, and to chiefly be grateful for having been brought up since I was 8 in a faith that has nourished me and taught me all the little that I know." So what are we to make of this? Tolkien himself was always emphatic that his writings could not be read as simple allegories. As he remarked rather tartly in one letter, The Lord of the Rings is not about anything but itself. Certainly it has no allegory intentions, general, particular, or topical, moral, religious, or political. The massive popularity of his story, with a global fan base of all faiths and none, shows that whatever the Lord of the Rings might be, it's certainly not a simple allegory of the Christian faith or a presentation of the Gospels in the guise of fantasy. But that's not to say that the Lord of the Rings bears no relationship to the Christian religion that Tolkien actually believed in. His great work is, as he says, of course, fundamentally religious and Catholic. The of course is very interesting. It seems natural and obvious to him that it should be so. And that is because, as Tolkien says, it is fundamentally Catholic. That is, at its fundament, its roots, its essence. This religious and Catholic element is, he explains, absorbed into the story and the symbolism. It's woven into the warp and the woof of the text. It's implicit, indirect. It wasn't consciously planned. Rather, the whole world of Middle-earth and everything in it is rooted in its author's Christian vision of reality. And he says that this rootedness, this unplanned but essential quality to his work, comes about because he has been raised and nourished in the Catholic faith. Tolkien's faith was lifelong and deep. He was a committed Christian, and he was not shy about saying so publicly. He also drew attention to the importance of his faith in his work. In one letter, Tolkien explained that there is a scale of significance in the types of facts that are relevant to understanding a writer's work. And he puts at the bottom of the scale his preference for certain languages, saying that although this has some relation to his writings, it does not really explain the works. Other facts, he says, are really significant, such as his rural childhood before the age of the machine, or his interest in language. But then he goes on to say, more important, I am a Christian, which can be deduced from my stories, and in fact, a Roman Catholic. We know that his childhood experiences and his linguistic interests were imaginatively formative. But by Tolkien's own reckoning, his faith was more important for understanding his writings than either of these. So if we are to understand and appreciate Tolkien's writings to the fullest degree, we need to look deeply and to understand what he himself identified as being fundamental to his identity and to the way that he expressed himself in his fiction. Now, the way that we go about this is important. Tolkien's faith was shaped by his personal context and his deliberate commitments in the spiritual life. He was a Christian, which means certain things in contrast to the generally secular approach of the modern world, in his day and in ours. More specifically, he was a Catholic, which provided a particular shape and structure for his faith. And not just a Catholic, but one who lived out his faith through the first 3/4 of the 20th century, which featured 2 world wars and major changes in the way that the church understood and expressed itself. Furthermore, Tolkien can only be fully understood if we appreciate that he was not just a 20th century Catholic, but an English Catholic, part of a faith community that had experienced persecution, marginalization, and restrictions on civil rights, some of which restrictions lasted into Tolkien's adult life. And lastly, his formation as an English Catholic of the 20th century was greatly shaped by the particular circumstances of his close connection in his childhood and his youth and throughout his life with the congregation of the Oratory of St. Philip Neri. So tonight, among the many things that I could trace, and the book that that this is drawn from, Tolkien's Faith, the Spiritual Biography, is 500 pages long. So there's a lot that I could draw from, hard to choose. Tonight, I want to draw just a few themes out to show the way that his faith was fundamental to the shaping of Middle-earth. And I want to look particularly at the themes of beauty, humor, humility, and suffering. To do that, we need to begin at the beginning. Tolkien was in fact baptized as an infant in the Anglican Cathedral of Bloemfontein, South Africa. But the heat of Bloemfontein was bad for his health, and when he was 3 years old, his mother Mabel took him and his baby brother Hilary back to England for what they thought would be a temporary visit. But they never returned. Tolkien never saw his father again. The following year, just as Mabel was preparing to bring the boys back to South Africa, his father Arthur died. So his widowed mother and her 2 sons stayed in Birmingham. And 4 years later, in 1900, Mabel was received into the Catholic Church. Her family was intensely hostile to the move, cutting off financial support and pressuring her to recant her Catholicism. Tolkien was 8 years old when his mother became a Catholic, and so being above the age of reason, he was considered by the church at that time to be an adult for this purpose and expected to be received into the church in his own right. And so, although Tolkien is often thought of as being a cradle Catholic, he was not. And though we might take it for granted that, of course, he remained a Catholic in honor of his mother, it could easily have been otherwise. He might have rejected the faith that led so directly to poverty and strain and tension with the extended family. He might have, after all, recognized that his grandparents, his uncles and aunts would have welcomed him back warmly into the Anglican faith of his dead father. In the strongly anti-Catholic culture of early 20th century, it would have made his life easier in many ways if he had reverted to Anglicanism, or if he had made his Catholic faith purely a private matter. But he didn't. Not as a boy, not as a young man, not later in life. He might have done so. And bearing that in mind will help us to appreciate more fully the shape of his faith and what it meant to him. Tolkien was confirmed as a Catholic shortly before his 12th birthday at the Birmingham Oratory, and he took the confirmation name of Philip, after St. Philip Neri, the 16th century Italian who was the founder of the Oratorians. And he even wove that name into the famous monogram of his initials. Now, this is something that my friend and colleague, Dr. Michael Ward, Father Michael Ward, has pointed out to me. He was actually the one who discovered this. I had shared with him the importance of the name Philip and the fact that Tolkien had taken the name Philip as his confirmation name. And he observed, see how there's the T, there's the J, there's the 2 mirrored R's. It's all very symmetrical. And look at that little spur on the side, that random little spur that you otherwise can't really account for. Well, I believe that's the base, that's the foot of the P, indicating that there's a hidden P in the monogram, sharing one of the loops of the R's. John Ronald Philip ruled Tolkien. After his mother died in 1904, the Birmingham Oratory became of central importance for Tolkien. Father Francis Morgan, a priest of the Oratory, became his guardian. And many years later, Tolkien recalled that at the Oratory, he had the advantage of a good Catholic home in excelsis, a home in the highest, virtually a junior inmate of the Oratory house, which contained many learned fathers, largely converts. The Oratory was a remarkable place for any young man to grow up, and especially for one as sensitive and brilliant as the young Tolkien. The Oratory in Birmingham was the first to be established in England. It was founded by none other than St. John Henry Newman. Before his entrance into the Catholic Church, Newman had been one of the leading lights of Oxford. He was fellow of Oriel College, Oxford, vicar of the University Church, and after he became a Catholic and was ordained a priest in Rome, he returned to England with his friends who had converted and been ordained alongside him to set up a religious community. And he chose the congregation of the Oratory of St. Philip Neri as the most suitable. He founded the Birmingham Oratory in 1852 and was its superior until his death in 1890. One of the reasons that Newman felt the oratorian rule was a good fit for himself and his fellow well-educated converts was that it allowed the retention of personal property, such as books, and encouraged scholarly pursuits among its members. And in addition to valuing the intellectual life, Newman explained that the oratorian rule sets great store by the arts as means to draw people closer to God, especially music. Oratories have a particular mission to the more highly educated in the community, and they emphasize outreach and evangelism through the beauty of architecture, vestments, and liturgy, especially liturgy in terms of music. Now, this positive attitude towards the intellectual life and the arts continued into Tolkien's day. The parish magazine of those years is full of poetry and articles about literature. And here, the young Tolkien, who was interested in art and literature from boyhood, found an environment that encouraged these aspects of his personality and his interests. The oratorians placed special attention on music. St. Philip decided that a good way to engage the young men of his day was to provide musical evenings, interwoven with scripture readings, lectures, and theological discussions. And it's because of this interest in music that composers began to create oratorios, which originally meant musical pieces written specifically for the oratory in Rome. And the Birmingham Oratory continued this tradition, producing new programs for musical evenings under the guidance of Father Robert Eaton. And it's worth considering whether these oratorios, interweaving scripture and music, might possibly have made some contribution to the inspiration for Tolkien's account in the Silmarillion of the creation of Middle-earth expressed in musical terms. Tolkien was also introduced at the oratory to plain chant, or Gregorian chant, something that he would probably not have heard as an Anglican. It made a great impression on Tolkien. His daughter Priscilla later recalled her father that the only kind of music I knew him to love dearly was Gregorian plain chant. And in fact, here we can trace a direct influence on Tolkien's Middle-earth. Soon after the publication of Lord of the Rings, Tolkien explained that a few of the songs are written to specific tunes. And one of these, he said, was the elvish chant that Galadriel sings to the Fellowship as they depart from Lothlorien. This, he says, is a lament that has in mind the tones used in the Lamentatio of Tenebrae. This is a chant from the Bible's Book of Lamentations, used during the Tenebrae prayer service of Holy Week. Another influence on the young Tolkien, both aesthetic and spiritual, was a sermon in stone, the Birmingham Oratory Church. Now, when Tolkien first came to the oratory as a 10-year-old boy, it was very different from the impressive building that stands there now on the Hagley Road. It was built in 1852 when the oratorian's funds were severely limited, and it had, as the oratorian's own historian Henry Friston described it, no pretensions of any sort to architectural beauty. In fact, it simply consisted of 4 plain brick walls and a roof. And the roof itself was bought ready-made and second-hand from a disused factory. It was, he said, dingy, shabby, and dowdy, although quaint and attractive in many ways, and entirely devotional. And I think this underscores also the intentionality of his mother Mabel's choice of bringing the boys to be parishioners at the Birmingham Oratory. This is something I talk about more in the book. But she didn't come to the oratory because of its exterior beauty. She could have taken the boys to St. Chad's Cathedral in Birmingham. She came to this dingy, shabby, dowdy building because of the oratorians themselves and their charism and what they could offer her and her family. So this is the church that he encountered as a boy. But then, during his boyhood, Tolkien witnessed the complete transformation of this building. The old church had been erected quickly and cheaply out of necessity, but as the size of the congregation increased, it quickly became crowded and inadequate. And so a decision was made to replace it with a new classical style basilica as a memorial to Cardinal Newman. And here we see it as it was celebrating the canonization of John Henry Newman. But since the Oratorians had no other land to build on, the memorial church was literally constructed around the old church, which remained in use for 2 years before it was finally demolished. It was gradually pulled down bit by bit as its successor was built. The first Mass was celebrated in this partly completed new building on October 9th, 1906, the anniversary of Newman's Tiber crossing, and it was officially opened on December 8th, 1909, the solemnity of the Immaculate Conception. Now, this choice of liturgically significant dates for the key stages in the opening of the church would have been Tolkien's first exposure to the way that layers of meaning can be created and the significance of events heightened by the deliberate intersection of the religious calendar with outward events. And here, perhaps, we may trace an early influence on Tolkien's later decision, when writing The Lord of the Rings, to arrange the events in his fictional world so that they corresponded with key dates in the life of Christ. The fellowship sets out from Rivendell on December 25th, the Nativity, and the ring is destroyed on March 25th, the Annunciation. Now, to be sure, Tolkien noted that the December 25th date arose first from the narrative chronology, just how the story unfolded. And of course, he notes that the story itself is pre-Christian. The world of Middle-earth is the world of the past. And so for the characters, these dates don't have any significance because the incarnation is in the future of Middle-earth. But, he said, he put in the date of March 25th on purpose and kept the December 25th date on purpose. He seems to have decided to keep this liturgical resonance and to add to it so that he could add in a layer of meaning for the reader who might observe it. Back to Tolkien's own life. This slow motion transformation of a plain utilitarian church into a place of great beauty must have made an impact on the young Tolkien. He was 12 when construction began, and he was 17 when it was completed. Here we had an outward and visible representation of the Oratorians' commitment to beauty in the Christian life, and a representation in art and architecture of what they believed as Catholics. And furthermore, this dismantling and rebuilding of the oratory church was an objective correlative to Tolkien's own life at the time. When the foundation stone was laid in the spring of 1904, his mother was still alive, and his domestic situation, although it featured poverty and certain amount of strain, was still solid and sound. But all too soon, that stability and security would be torn apart by Mabel's death. And then a new stability would emerge, slowly, painfully, in a gradual process of reconstruction. Tolkien's early years were indeed full of loss and sorrow. By the age of 12, he'd lost first his father and then his deeply beloved mother. And as a teenager, he fell in love, only to have Father Francis forbid him to have any contact with his sweetheart for 3 years until he came of age. And he obeyed, although it was very painful, out of love for his guardian, whom he considered his second father. When he did reconnect with Edith, and that is a dramatic story of its own, it was in 1916 that they were married, and that was shortly before Tolkien was sent to the front lines of the Great War, where he fought in the Battle of the Somme. Tolkien later recalled that all but one of his close friends were killed in the war. He himself contracted a severe case of French fever, which became chronic and contributed to health problems throughout his life. These experiences would certainly be more than enough to account for a bleak view of life. And Tolkien certainly had a depressive and melancholy streak in his character. But what's surprising is not that he had these times of melancholy, but rather that he also had a deep-seated sense of joy and fun. His exceptionally complex intellect was balanced by what he described in later years as a very simple sense of humor, which even my appreciative critics find tiresome. And here we can see another influence from those formative years at the oratory. St. Philip, as well as being called the third apostle of Rome, is also called the apostle of joy. As St. Philip taught, the first remedy against melancholy was to have a good conscience, wherefore the saint prescribed the powerful means of a general confession. Hence his maxim that they should maintain cheerfulness and preserve themselves from sin. The approach of the Oratorians in nurturing spiritual health through fostering cheerfulness, even or especially in hard times, would certainly have been of assistance in helping the orphaned young Tolkien ease back into enjoyment of life. And Tolkien had an inclination to be silly throughout his life. Hugh Rogan recalled an episode from his childhood when Tolkien came to visit the family and showed off his party trick. He went up to the first floor landing and fell all the way down quite spectacularly. A dozen steps, I guess. Arms and legs splaying about in all directions in an immense splatter. We were literally breathtaking. I think he drew the polar bear in Father Christmas Letters from Life. And the invitations he sent for his son Christopher's 21st birthday party show his sense of humor as well. Carriages at midnight, ambulances at 2 a.m., wheelbarrows at 5 a.m., curses at daybreak. Must have been a good party. Now, some of the stories of Tolkien's adult sense of humor can seem rather undignified, even a little embarrassing. So, for instance, as an elderly man, at one point he paid for a purchase at a shop with a handful of coins that included his false teeth. And I can only imagine that he must have sneezed or coughed and found his dentures in his hand and then just sort of handed over the whole lot. And until I did my research for this book, that scene had always puzzled me. It's kind of gross. Well, what is he doing? Isn't this a little inappropriate for this, this serious academic professor, the author of The Lord of the Rings, an Oxford professor? Shouldn't he live up to his status as a figure of high academic and literary repute? But not according to the teachings of St. Philip Neri. St. Philip considered spiritual pride to be a serious danger and humility the best remedy. Philip remarked, "Let us pray God, if he gives us any virtue or any gift, to keep it hidden even from ourselves, that we may preserve our humility and not take occasion of pride because of it." Now, Philip himself was an exceptionally gifted man. He was widely considered a saint in his own lifetime. But though he took the spiritual life very seriously, he never took himself too seriously. So, for instance, on one occasion, he showed up at a big, important party with half of his beard shaved off. Just half. Why did he do that? It was because he realized that the host, who was one of the richest men in Rome, had only invited him to the party to show off, here's my pet saint, look at how important I am. And so Philip made himself look like a fool to undercut these pretenses. So this Philippine teaching on humility that Tolkien absorbed as a young man, it didn't preclude achievement or even pride in achievement, but it sought to keep the right perspective. Philip warns against pursuing achievements for the sake of worldly praise. But he was also aware of a kind of scrupulosity that could arise. And so Philip explained, it does not take away our merit in the spiritual life if we enjoy praise and acclaim for our work, as long as it wasn't deliberately sought after for its own sake. If we've done good work, then we are to accept whatever praise or acclaim comes from it, but not dwell on it or treat it as if it's important. And this early formation in humor and humility would stand Tolkien in good stead. When first The Hobbit and then The Lord of the Rings became a worldwide sensation, the fan mail just poured in, often of the most gushing kind, usually from Americans. And Tolkien was from the start alert to the spiritual dangers of this lavish praise, which he calls incense, as in the incense offered before idols. In 1944, he remarked on a fan letter that he'd received from an American boy who declared that he had read The Hobbit no fewer than 11 times. And Tolkien's comment is telling. Though he admitted that the smell of incense was pleasing, letters like these, he said, make me rather sad. What thousands of grains of good human corn must fall on barren, stony ground if such a very small drop of water should be so intoxicating. But I suppose one should be grateful even for the grace and fortune that have allowed me to provide even the drop. Then, in the last year of his life, he commented, being a cult figure in one's own lifetime, I'm afraid is not at all pleasant. However, I do not find that it tends to puff one up. In my case, at any rate, it makes me feel extremely small and inadequate. But even the nose of a very modest idol cannot remain entirely untickled by the sweet smell of incense. So Tolkien could laugh both at this excessive veneration and also at his own readiness to enjoy it. And he could stay grounded, due in no small part to his formation in the spirituality of St. Phil of Neri. And this aspect of Tolkien's personality is reflected in his most famous creation, the Hobbits. A people who are by nature merry and full of laughter, they're fond of cheerful jests at all times, they are hospitable and delighted in parties. But in noting Tolkien's famous remark, I am in fact a hobbit in all but size, we will do well to remember his description of the hobbits as also being curiously tough. As he puts it in the prologue of The Lord of the Rings, hobbits were perhaps so unwearyingly fond of good things, not least because they could, when put to it, do without them, and could survive rough handling by grief, foe, or weather in a way that astonished those who did not know them well and looked no further than their bellies and their well-fed faces. The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings take their characters and the reader through darkness, sorrow, and loss, but the stories are deeply grounded in the simple, joyful, humble life of hobbits in the Shire, where both books begin and end. Humor, then, has taken us to humility. And here we may well be reminded that Tolkien had a great devotion to Mary. He once said that it was upon Our Lady that all my own small perception of beauty, both in majesty and simplicity, is founded. One of the prayers that Tolkien recommended learning by heart was the Magnificat, Mary's song of praise. We should be reminded of these words. He hath regarded the humility of his handmaid. He hath scattered the proud in the imagination of their heart. He hath put down the mighty from their seat, and hath exalted the humble. And it is in almost exactly these terms that Tolkien explained one of the fundamental themes of The Lord of the Rings. It was, he wrote, planned to be hobbitocentric, that is, primarily a study of the ennoblement or sanctification of the humble. And elsewhere, his thoughts on this theme led him to quote directly from the Magnificat. He remarks that he saw the value of hobbits in putting earth under the feet of romance and in providing subjects for ennoblement and heroes more praiseworthy than the professionals. I would not be a hero is, of course, as good a start for a hero as I would not be a bishop or a bishop. And then in the very next sentence, he adds, we are all equal before the great author who puts down the mighty from their seat and exalts the humble. So it was evidently very natural for him in his mind to connect the humility of the hobbits to the humility of Mary. Another prayer that Tolkien found deeply meaningful is the Litany of Loretto, which he also recommended learning by heart, and he translated a portion of it into his Elvish language of Quenya, as one does. In the Litany of Loretto, Mary is addressed under various titles, and some present her in symbolic terms such as Mirror of Justice, Mystical Rose, and Seat of Wisdom. And one of these titles is Consolatrix Afflictorum, meaning Comforter of the Afflicted. In 1916, when Tolkien was in the trenches in France, on the front lines of the Great War, he wrote a poem in honor of Mary, which begins with the line, O Lady Mother enthroned amid the stars. And he gave the poem two different titles. One of these was Consolatrix Afflictorum, one of the Marian titles from the Litany of Loretto. And given the circumstances, it's not surprising that he chose to reflect on Mary as the comforter of the afflicted. The other title that he gave it was Stella Vespertina. And this is connected to the Litany of Loretto at one remove. It's Tolkien's own invention, and it's an intriguing variant of one of the Litany's titles for Mary, namely Stella Matutina. Whereas Stella Matutina means morning star, Tolkien's variant means evening star. Now, the symbolism of the morning and the evening star is rich and complex in Christian iconography, and there are several different ways this ends up having an influence on Tolkien's work. But we should always remember that tracing one line of influence does not preclude many other ways in which that influence has an effect. With regard to the Litany of Loretto, Mary is the Stella Matutina, the morning star, because Christ is symbolized by the sun. So with this imagery, his mother Mary, who brought him into the world at the Nativity, is associated with the morning star, as she is the lesser light that indicates the imminent arrival of the greater light. And that's the imagery of her title, Stella Matutina, in the Litany of Loretto. Now, Tolkien was interested in astronomy, and he would have known that both the morning star and the evening star refer to the planet Venus, since it becomes visible in the western sky after sunset, as well as in the eastern sky before sunrise. And these celestial appearances would have become weighted with deep emotional and spiritual significance once he began to serve on the front lines of the Great War. In the Great War, soldiers were required to stand to at dawn and dusk each day. As historian Paul Fussell explains, stand to was a solemn moment. Twice a day, everyone stared silently across the wasteland at the enemy's hiding places and considered how to act if a field gray line suddenly appeared and grew larger and larger through the mist and the half-light. The military routines of standing to arms in combat readiness at daybreak and nightfall were, as Fussell notes, moments of heightened ritual anxiety, which were all the more cruelly wrenching in contrast with the prevailing literary conceits of dawn and dusk as images of peace and tranquility. So Tolkien's adaptation of the litany to address Mary as Stella Vespertina, as opposed to Stella Matutina, is therefore both astronomically and theologically apt, and all the more so when it's paired with his other title, Consolatrix ad Laudorum. The image of Mary as the evening star invites us to consider how she is visible when the sun, her son, has disappeared beyond the horizon. Christ may have died, but his mother is still present, consoling those who, like her, mourn his loss. And in the nightmarish situation of the trenches, with the problem of evil and suffering so clearly apparent, this is a powerful image of faith as experienced, or at least hoped for, in darkness. Years later, Tolkien gave to his character Arwen in The Lord of the Rings the name Undomiel, meaning evening star. And in calling her the evening star, he was giving her a title that had Marian resonances for him, and specifically ones that were rooted in his Great War experiences. And the significance of this title is underscored by the fact that it's twice contrasted with the beauty of full daylight as represented by Galadriel. Gimli the dwarf prefers Galadriel's beauty, and he challenges Eomer, wants Eomer to agree with him. But when Eomer puts Arwen first, Gimli concedes, "You have chosen the evening, but my love is given to the morning, and my heart forebodes that soon it will pass away forever." And likewise, Frodo, after seeing Arwen, the even star of her people, declares, "Now not day only shall be beloved, but night too shall be beautiful and blessed." Evidently, this finding of beauty in the night was of tremendous importance for Tolkien. It allowed him to explore in The Lord of the Rings images and tales of great darkness without losing sight of hope. In his 1916 poem, Tolkien described Mary as enthroned amid the stars, another indication he sees her as a figure present in the darkness of night, not just the brightness of day. And we can perhaps see the influence of this celestial image of Mary in the scene where Sam and Frodo, having escaped from the orcs, begin their seemingly hopeless trek into Mordor. Sam looks up, and he sees a single star shining through the cloud wrap above the mountains. The beauty of it smote his heart as he looked up out of the forsaken land, and hope returned to him. For like a shaft clear and cold, the thought pierced him, but in the end, the shadow was only a small, passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. Tolkien was a man who endured much sorrow, and he recognized that there are some wounds that cannot be healed in this life. One of the most moving lines, I feel, in Lord of the Rings is at the very end, when Frodo explains that he has been wounded too deeply, that he must go on to the Grey Havens, and he cannot live out his life in the restored Shire as he had hoped. "I have been too deeply hurt, Sam. I tried to save the Shire, and it has been saved, but not for me. But not for me." Tolkien recognized that there are some wounds that can't be healed, and he never pretended that this pain and that grief and loss don't exist. As he says in his poem, Mythopoeia, "Pain is pain, and evil is." Many of his contemporaries abandoned their faith in the darkness of the Great War, but he didn't. He persevered. It wasn't easy, though. After the war, he went through a barren stretch in which, as he recalled later, "I almost ceased to practice my religion." His faith was ultimately renewed, though, and made stronger, but it was hard-won. And this hard-won faith meant that he understood beauty to be more lasting than sorrow. He believed that there is a happy ending, not just in stories, but in reality. In his great essay on fairy stories, Tolkien says this of the happy ending of a fairy story. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, sorrow, and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and insofar is evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. Beauty, humor, humility, sorrow, suffering, and hope. These were all woven together in Tolkien's spirituality. And I believe that these aspects of his faith form part of the foundations of Middle-earth, in that deep soil in which all the stories of his legendarium are rooted. Thank you. Yeah, this is a lovely question. This is my book on Amazon. Thank you. I did not ask her to ask that question. This is entirely. It depends where. I think it will be in Canada. It's been a little bit slow coming to Canada, but I heard from my publisher right before I got here that as soon as the second printing, there's a second printing already. This is extremely gratifying. As soon as the second printing comes out, which will be soon, they're going to ship, they're going to have stock in Word on Fire's Canada store. So you can go to wordonfire.org/Tolkien, and it goes default to the US store, but then you can see the different regions underneath it. You can put Canada, takes you to the Canada store. And right now it says sold out and notify me when available. If you click the notify me and you put your email address, it will notify you when it's in stock. And it will be. I asked specifically, I said, I'm going to Canada, they're going to have books. And he said, soon. Yes, but questions about the actual content, some questions.
First of all, thank you, Professor, for the enlightenment. My question is, how would you say my initial understanding was that it was a depiction of the Industrial Revolution and its failure due to the agricultural side. Is that?
So what like in Lord of the Rings, you mean? So there's one of the things I think is really useful to think about is that Tolkien is drawing on many different sources. And in fact, my previous Tolkien book is about his modern reading, which I make the point that his medieval reading is hugely important, but also his modern reading. And so, the themes of dealing with technology and what that does to society is also a theme. But this is sort of handing you a lovely thing to talk about, because it's quite interesting. Tolkien's views on technology are considerably more nuanced than most people think. Most people tend to think that he was a bit of a Luddite. That's how, like, a lot of films and things depict him. That's just absolutely incorrect. He was very strongly against the abuse of technology. And it's really interesting. In his lifetime, many of his interviewers just assumed that anybody who was interested in medieval culture and literature must, of course, hate everything modern. And they would give him leading questions. And he sometimes got a little bit irritated. In one interview, he said, I am very interested in what goes on in the modern world. And he says, he lays out, I'm interested in local events, national events, and the international events. And he was. He even said, I take 3 newspapers. So he was very interested in what was going on in the world. And he also was quite willing to use technology. We must remember, in his lifetime, things were technology that today are absolutely retro, like typewriters. He was a typewriter nerd. He had 3 different typewriters with special keyboards with philological symbols. This is technology. This is technology, especially when you consider that his good friend C.S. Lewis flatly refused to use a typewriter and used a dip pen his entire life. So, and then he was also interested in voice recorders. He at one point really wanted to be given the opportunity to read his poem Sir Gawain the Green Knight on the radio. Again, radio, this is a technology, and he went to London to audition for it, and they didn't pick him, but he was practicing for it using a voice recorder at home. And he wrote a letter, I read it, it's in the British Museum, where he's writing to his grandson. And there's a whole paragraph comparing the merits of different models of voice recorders. What he was against was the abuse of technology. So for instance, he even said that he enjoyed driving cars and riding in them. But what he objected to was the way that road makers just blasted their roads and their highways through the countryside, paving over everything in sight without any restraint. So it's much more nuanced. And I think if you have that in mind when you read Lord of the Rings, you can see it gives you, there's more depth even there than you might realize. He is thinking about industrialization, but he is not doing it just from a nostalgic kind of twee point of view. It's much more nuanced. Right, okay. I love Tolkien. I can talk about it indefinitely. You must ask more questions, so I'll get on to new ones. It's all the way in the back.
Thank you. That was a wonderful, especially time in Tolkien with the oratory very close to my heart. I had a guest in my house just over dinner, and they said there was a recent film about Tolkien. They didn't mention his faith once. So my two questions for you are, do you find in your culture there is this resistance to a Christian interpretation of Lord of the Rings? And secondly, when Tolkien was saying it wasn't an allegory, I don't think an author or an artist can possibly produce a work that's not somewhat allegorical.
Okay, so two questions. Let me take them. I'll forget them. So there's allegory, and then there's the Christian interpretation.
Yes, so the Christian interpretation one.
Right. So first, like, is there resistance to a Christian interpretation of Tolkien's writings? Yes, there is. And in the wider world, a lot of people don't want to think about Tolkien as a Christian, and I have a certain amount of sympathy with that point of view, because I will be perfectly honest, there are a fair few books about Tolkien and his faith that are about as light touched as a punch in the face. They're very heavy-handed, they're very sort of, proselytizing, very trying to interpret everything as if it were all about the Gospels. And it's not, and Tolkien himself says not. So I think people can sometimes be a bit put off by very in-your-face evangelism that tries to force a Christian message onto everything. And I also think that people in the wider world, generally speaking, know very little about Catholicism in particular. And so a lot of people, knowing almost nothing, assume that because Tolkien was a Catholic, he must have been bigoted, and they love Tolkien, they don't want him to be a bigot, and so they try to protect themselves from that by forgetting about the aspect of his faith. And I kind of get that, because they love him, and they want to keep loving him. But the thing they need to realize is that there's nothing to fear. He wasn't bigoted, he was big-hearted. And that's one of the things that I tried to unpack in Tolkien's faith. Tolkien's faith, this book, is written as best as I could from a completely objective standpoint. I mean, in the first chapter, I say, I am myself a Catholic, I share his beliefs, but I'm not trying to convince you that these beliefs are true. I'm just trying to share with you, dear reader, what did Tolkien believe? What did it mean to him? How did it shape his life? And I think that is really necessary, because people are very sort of touchy about well, if I find out about his faith, are they gonna make an altar call at the end? Well, no, we need to just let people learn about his faith, understand him better, and then they will, I hope, be less afraid of thinking about him as a Christian, as a Catholic, because they'll just understand him better. So that's the first question. The second one is allegory. Just very briefly, I am myself a literature professor. Allegory and Tolkien and Lewis both. Allegory is a very specific literary device. And in the modern day, people use allegory to cover very inaccurately. They use it to mean everything from allusion to image to metaphor to the whole 9 yards. Allegory is a very specific thing where there's a map. Think Animal Farm, think Pilgrim's Progress. You have a whole structure, conceptual structure, and all maps onto what's going on in the story. That is what allegory is. The Lord of the Rings, just from a literary point of view, is not an allegory. It's just not. So we must remember that, and that's going to allow us to not kind of force it into ways that it won't go. There are lots of literary resonances in it that come from scripture. I didn't even time to talk about half of those. There's lots of imagery, but the imagery comes out in ways that are subtle. So for instance, the Marian imagery in Lord of the Rings. Most people, if pushed, would say, oh, Galadriel. Now that you've heard my talk, you might say, oh, Arwen. But now you've also heard my talk, you say, oh, hobbits. Because the hobbits, their humility is a Marian quality. And Tolkien himself, as we have just seen tonight, explicitly connected Mary's Magnificat with the hobbits. So that shows us that the way that he is putting these Christian themes into his work is subtle. All right, good. Another question. Yes.
Thank you again. As Professor Beaman said, a wonderful lecture. You've mentioned C.S. Lewis a few times. In your book, do you talk about the interaction between the two and how that affected the faith, or at least the expression of Tolkien?
Yes, I do. I've got two big chapters on Lewis. Lewis is a really important figure in Tolkien's life. So just to kind of give a very brief bit, Tolkien was very important in helping Lewis become Christian, and Lewis was very important in helping Tolkien to strengthen his own faith. So it was actually maybe not an exactly parallel relationship, but it was a relationship that was mutual. It was going back and forth. And Tolkien himself said of Lewis, he said that his friendship with Lewis has done me much good from contact with a man who is a lover of our Lord. So it was a very helpful, deep spiritual friendship for Tolkien. Yes. Let's see. I want to make sure I get questions from outside of my side of the point of view. Yes.
Did Tolkien have any experience in menial labor? I ask that because there have just been a couple times I've entered the trade workforce, and there have been a couple of times, especially intimate encounters with cobwebs, that I think this guy must have been in the basement.
Yes. So did Tolkien have experience with menial labor? Yes. Well, first of all, I mean, he was a soldier, so that was something. But then, as an adult man with a family of 4 children, he did a lot of helping out around the house. And so there's an interview with his daughter who's correcting a perception that her father was some sort of absent-minded professor who never did anything. And she said, well, he would, for instance, like fix the electric kettle when it broke. And they had chickens for a while, and he cared for the chickens. And he was a gardener. So he was literally getting his hands dirty. So yes, he was pretty grounded. So he was out there, cleaning out a chicken coop and fixing the kettle and all that sort of thing. Yeah. Let's see. This right here. Yes.
What about his wife? Was there a huge influence there, or even his wife's family in regard to his Catholicism, or hers?
Right, so what about his wife? Well, his wife was an orphan, so she didn't have any family there. And this is, it's interesting because in my research on Tolkien, I kept focused on Tolkien, and I talk about his wife and his children only insofar as they influence him or are relevant to his faith life. So Edith, when he meets Edith, she was a Protestant, and she becomes a Catholic before they're married. And so that dynamic was an important part of his early years. But it's interesting, one of the things I learned in my research was that under the canon law and the circumstances of the time in England, Edith did not have to become a Catholic for them to marry. It would have been possible and actually reasonably straightforward for them to marry. They could have gotten dispensation and had a valid marriage. And I think that's important to realize that this wasn't him, she didn't have to become a Catholic if they were going to get married. She chose to become a Catholic, and Tolkien obviously wanted her to, but he wanted her to become a Catholic not just so we could get married, but because he wanted to welcome her into the church that he loved so much. Yeah, there was a yes.
What about his parents? What do you know about their artistic and literary interests?
So what about his parents? Well, sadly, because they died so young, I mean, there isn't a lot of influence on them. There's not a lot of evidence of their influence on him, but what we do know of his mother is that she was an absolutely remarkable woman. What we would now say, she homeschooled him for the first few years of his life. That wasn't the term that they would have used then. She taught him Latin. She taught him botany. She's a very, very educated, thoughtful woman, and encouraged him in his intellectual and artistic pursuits, and gave him his first formation, as a Christian, and then as a Catholic. So Mabel was just an amazing woman, and I came to admire her even more as I did more research on it. And it's such a tragedy, that she died so young. He was only 12 when she died, but she was an amazing woman, and I think did a lot to set him on this trajectory. She recognized his gifts very, very early on. Yeah. Let's see. Back. Yes. Yes. Like you just had your hand up. Yes, you. Yes.
Yes. I'm curious. What about Hillary? So he went to the oratory. What happened to her?
So Hillary, what happened to his little brother?
It's a brother.
Yes, it's a brother. Yes, it's one of those names that has now become. Yes. So Hillary Arthur ruled Tolkien. Hillary remained a faithful Catholic all his life, and
he went to the oratory as well.
Yeah, so they both went to the oratory. They had the same upbringing in the oratory, but Hillary decided they both fought the Great War, and Hillary became a farmer of fruit. He became a farmer, and they had a good relationship through their whole life. And Tolkien would go and visit his brother and was in great terms with him, and he remained a faithful Catholic. So he also was formed in that oratory spirituality alongside his brother. Yeah. So bouncing over here, yes.
I have just two questions.
I'm trying to just one, please.
Okay. No, wait a second.
Pick one.
Joseph Pierce talks about Tolkien's genre being more close to a fairy story rather than an allegory.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you could say anything on that or your perspective on it.
Well, I mean, he's correct. It's because it's not an allegory. It is what Tolkien himself described it as a fairy story. But Tolkien's term fairy story is what he means by fairy story is what we now mean by the genre of fantasy. But I think it is very important, and I'm glad that Joseph underscores that, because it's not an allegory. It has lots of thematic resonances, and it has what Tolkien said is applicability, which resides in the freedom of the reader to make associations. Yeah. Good. Another question. Yes, from our cameraman.
One of our live streaming participants, Mark Frera, asks, how might Tolkien's writing be presented to a secular audience in a way that invites people to learn about Tolkien's faith and Christian themes in his writings?
Right. Well, that's a good question. That's perhaps our challenge, right? How might his writings be presented to a wider audience so that they appreciate those Christian themes? Well, I'm trying to do my bit. I think we can do it best by trying to strive for accuracy. We can sometimes, with all good intentions, be tempted to overstate and to make a more blatant Christian theme, or to, kind of draw the heavy underlining underneath it, and sometimes forget that can be off-putting. So I think a light touch and not pushing things too far. So to point out, for instance, that there are some resonances. There are Christ figures, plural, You know, there Aragorn is a Christ figure, Frodo, Gandalf, Sam. These are Christ figures in there. But I think more fundamentally to talk about the sort of underlying themes. So, for instance, one of the big themes, Christian themes of Lord of the Rings, is the importance of mercy and pity. Those are important themes. They're deeply Christian themes, and I think if we can talk about those, we can help people to access the vision that Tolkien has. But let's not try to twist Nilay's arm. I think that never helps anybody. Yeah. Let's see, another question. Natasha.
George MacDonald uses the image of a morning star and he associates it with the night in Fantasties. And so I'm wondering, I know MacDonald influenced Lewis. Did MacDonald influence Tolkien?
Yes. Well, so MacDonald uses the imagery of the morning star in Fantasties, which Tolkien had read and which he disliked Fantasties very much. So, yeah. I've got a whole chapter on MacDonald in Tolkien's Modern Reading. So MacDonald was actually an influence on him. He admits, and he recognized that he got his goblins from MacDonald. They're very much MacDonald's goblins. But I think he found MacDonald to be a little bit too heavy-handed in his Christian themes. He later got a bit annoyed with MacDonald. So I think in that case, it's a coincidence rather than a cause and effect. Yes. Let's see, over here from this shadowy corner of the room. Your shadow, because I wanted to have a better light on my PowerPoint, so sorry. From the gloom, way back in the gloom.
Obviously, Middle Earth is related to the pagan mythology of Northern Europe. I'm wondering if there's anything that can be said about these stories being sort of baptism of that tradition.
Yes, so in what way is the Lord of the Rings sort of a baptism of the pagan tradition? Well, yes, I think that's so. I think he talks about, and I quote this in the book, he talks about the way that he gets quite angry about Hitler for many reasons. He is, I think, go Tolkien, before it was widely recognized what Hitler was doing, Tolkien was calling Hitler demonic. He said he was a man, he's meaning it quite literally. He speaks of Hitler as being inspired by a demonic impulse. He doesn't mince any words on that. And one of the things that he's really angry about is the way that Nazism has perverted the northern spirit that was earliest Christianized in England. And he obviously, he thinks it's a good thing that this northern spirit has been purified and Christianized, even while retaining its epic form. And he's quite angry that the Nazis are spoiling it, which they did. They really did a number on Germanic mythology and how we can view it today. So I think he was trying to take that, because he's drawing on all this mythology. He loves all this pagan mythology. And this is an interesting thing. A lot of secular critics, secular scholars of Tolkien, secular readers of Tolkien, are quite confused about the way that Tolkien has this love for pagan literature and how he draws us in. And they often see a tension. They perceive a tension. Is Tolkien really kind of secret pagan? Is this in conflict with him being Christian? And of course, the answer is he's a Catholic, right? All truth is God's truth. All these expressions. He's very much grounded in natural theology. So he's assimilating all that is good, all the heroic virtues. He's assimilating into his world of Middle Earth, but he's purifying them. So, for instance, the fact that the hobbits are the heroes of the Lord of the Rings, the fact that their weakness is a virtue, is utterly antithetical to the pagan view. In pagan mythology, it's a bad thing to be weak. To be strong is everything. To be weak and to be humble is to be worthless. So the very idea that the humble hobbits are the ones who save Middle Earth is fundamentally Catholic. It's a baptism of the pagan ideals. Because in his world of Middle Earth, it is the world of the one God. He once had an interviewer, so puzzled, is there God in Middle Earth? Yes. And then the interviewer said, well, then who is he? And Tolkien said, the God, of course, the one. So yes, that would be the answer to that question. He does baptize. So let's see. Other questions? Yes. Okay, who is Tom Bombadil? Well, Tolkien said that Tom Bombadil just came sort of bouncing into the stories. He existed in poems before the Lord of the Rings was written, and he was based on a toy that the children had, on a Dutch doll. Yes, it was a toy that they had. There were several toys that ended up having transient influences on the Lord of the Rings. Priscilla had a toy bear named Bingo, and in the early drafts of The Hobbit, Bilbo is named Bingo Baggins. So we can all be glad to change that. And Tom is mysterious. I don't think even Tolkien really knew. This is a mystery, it's an artistic creation. He did say in a letter that Tom does, this is so Tolkien. He says, Tom is not allegorical. No, Tom Bombadil is not allegorical. And then he says, but actually he represents the spirit of the Oxfordshire countryside. This is such a Tolkien move. What I think he does, and I've spent so much time thinking about Tolkien. I think I've got to read his personality. He kind of wanted to preemptively clear the decks of misunderstandings. No allegory. I hate it. Never. We're all clear on that, right? Okay, now I'll tell you the nuanced way that I'm doing it. So there you have it. He's a figure from outside. He is a figure tied in some way to the Oxfordshire countryside. He is mysterious. He is Tom. There you go. I dare not say more, else I would be rushing in where angels fear to tread. Let's see. Yes.
My question is somewhat similar to a few questions ago. It's with regards to Tolkien and the occult.
Sorry, say a little more loudly.
It's with regards to Tolkien and the occult. Some of my friends, who I think are a bit more rigid in the Constitution, have objected to Tolkien's depiction of fantasy and magic. And Tolkien himself, in an interview that I watched recently, was talking about when asked whether the Lord of the Rings was used in sort of an escapist way, he said, of course, it's escapist in the true sense of the word, like a man escaping from prison. And so he seems to have a very unique sort of relationship with fantasy. Do you know how he might help somebody reconcile your trepidation with I guess, your kind of sketchy relationship between magic?
Yes, this is a great question. Well, the first thing I would say is that it is good and right to be cautious about associations with the occult, because the occult is dangerous and we should not associate with it. And Tolkien would affirm that 100%. And I think that's really important. I mean, Tolkien was a faithful Catholic. He was totally clear on this. There is no ambiguity that he would have rejected totally anything along those lines. And I think one of the reasons that he had a certain discomfort with his fellow Inkling, Charles Williams, is that Charles Williams did dabble in the occult. And Williams is not a spiritually healthy man. And now if you want to kind of contrast, that would be the one. And Tolkien really intensely disliked Williams's novels, some of which do actually have a bit of an occultish flavor. So that's I think an interesting point to bring up. So I think we would have to then say, well, what do we mean by the occult, and in what way is fantasy, doing that? Well, Tolkien is not depicting anything that involves doing magic. If you think about it, the world of Middle Earth, it's fantasy, but what do we have as far as magic? We don't have spells being cast. The closest we get to things that might look sort of necromantic-ish are things like Saruman, who's Babylon, right? Or Denethor gazing into the Palantir endlessly and seeing the visions given to him by Sauron, and this is a bad thing, right? He's being duped by Sauron. But even Gandalf is a servant of the secret fire, and Tolkien said to his friend Kilby that the secret fire is the Holy Spirit. So what Gandalf is doing is he is simply basically being an advocate for the work of the Spirit, if you want to put it in very kind of Catholic terms. So there's nothing in the story of the Lord of the Rings that would even remotely lead you to dabble in doing any sort of occultish kinds of things. And I think to say, okay, well, fantasy as a genre, it's an imagining of other worlds, other possibilities. Any sort of storytelling is a kind of fantasy. And that is using the imagination that God gave us. And Tolkien, in his poem Mythopoeia, which is very much worth reading, you read the whole thing, it's the collection Tree and Leaf. In his poem Mythopoeia, he says that we can use our imagination to create evil things. We can imagine goblins and monsters and dark things. But he says, we make still by the law in which we're made. We create because we are made in the image and likeness of a maker. So fundamentally, our creative action is being part of being made in God's image, because God is the ultimate creator. God is the ultimate artist, the ultimate storyteller. And I think Tolkien is so deeply grounded as a Christian that everything he's doing is coming from that. Yeah. Good. Let's see. No. Yes.
Sorry, I have to ask this question. What do you think happened to the egg white?
I don't know. It's such a sad story, isn't it? And I think this is in a way part of the genius of Tolkien, that he paints this canvas that's so broad that it extends beyond our view. I don't know what happened to the Endwise, but I wish I did. And he doesn't tell us. But you know what? In heaven, we'll know. We'll ask him. Yes. Good. Yes. Another question over here on the left, perhaps. Oh, but actually, you got it first. Yes.
Okay. It's really amazing how Tolkien, all the suffering he went through. Like, he loses his mom, his brother.
No, not his brother.
Oh, not his brother.
Not his brother.
His son.
It's his dad.
His dad. Okay. And
most of his friends.
And then the war too. So, and in the Christian faith, we always say God allows, or bad things, he turns it into good. So did he reflect a lot on his story about how all that suffering turned into a really beautiful work of art?
Well, I mean, we see it in his art that it did. I mean, he was an Englishman, and an Englishman of that particular generation. He didn't talk a lot about these things. He did somewhat. I mean, it's interesting because some of the people who went through the Great War just never spoke of it again. Lewis, for instance, never spoke of his wartime experience. But Tolkien actually did talk about it a little bit, at least to his children and to some of his colleagues. So he was able to talk about it, but he didn't talk a lot about how it shaped his work. That wouldn't have been the kind of thing that he would have talked about it, not in his personality. But I think when you look at The Lord of the Rings, you can see it. And I would recommend for anybody interested in this, John Garth has written a magnificent book. It's called Tolkien and the Great War. It's fantastic. He's a fantastic Tolkien biographer. He's really been my inspiration as a biographer of Tolkien. And that book specifically looks at Tolkien's war experiences and how it shapes his fiction. So I would absolutely recommend that. Yeah. Yes.
Just a curiosity question. Who is your favorite character from The Lord of the Rings and why?
Oh, who's my favorite character? It's tough. I mean, I'm very fond of Eowyn. not least because I fenced saber competitively for about 20 years, and so, women's swords. But I must say, that was the character I probably loved most in my 20s. But now I think I'm middle-aged, and Sam, he just wants to go home and have a garden. I love Sam. He is just the best. Yeah.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap up the question period now, and we have Dr. Pearson, the chair of literature here, and Release to Wisdom will give thanks to.
So I want to thank you for, actually, on behalf of 3 communities. The first one, myself, because back in around this time last year, we were part of a conference together, and you gave a paper on your material with regard to Tolkien and the oratorians. And that really clicked for me because I've been looking for the spiritual source of hobbits for a while. I'm an Anglo-Saxonist, so I was thinking, where is it in Old English? It's not there. And when you said that, when you presented that paper on the oratorians about spirituality, that really clicked, and it's been incorporated into my scholarship and my understanding of Tolkien. So I want to thank you personally for that. I also want to thank you on behalf of our literature department and the whole community here at Seed of Wisdom, just for the marvelous presentation you've given. You've only given a fraction of what you do in the book. I'm about a third of the way through the book, and there's lots of stuff there. But thank you for the fraction that you've given us. And then I want to just thank you on behalf of Tolkien fans everywhere, because the book, as I'm reading it, I'm finding it, it's so clear, so lucid, and not at all coercive, which I really appreciate. It's not trying to twist our arms and say we must compel Tolkien to mean this. No, it's sifting through all that deep historical evidence and really giving, I feel like it's a gift to Tolkien enthusiasts worldwide. And I'm getting responses. I posted myself with the book on Facebook, and my friends all over online were very pleased with that. So thank you on behalf of all those 2 communities. And we have